My name is Cindy Ives. I am professor of distance education at Athabasca University. My history with AMTEC goes back to when I worked for the National Film Board in the 1980s. And then later, when I was in distance education program development at Laurentian University in the late 1990s. That continued through my graduate studies at Concordia University, where I was studying for a PhD in educational technology. And since 2007, I have been a member of CNIE, which we'll talk about later. And I am currently past president of CNIE.
Hi, everyone. My name is Diane Janes. I am also a longtime member of AMTEC through my graduate studies, mostly my master's degree. I became part of AMTEC and CADE before they became CNIE, and also served as a CNIE president and regional director at some point, secretary at another point. My time with educational technology does go back to my being involved with my graduate studies, and I'm currently coordinator with Thompson Rivers University.
I'm Chris Crowley. I am the manager of the Learning Design team at the University of British Columbia. My involvement with AMTEC goes back to the mid-90s, early 2000s, where I was involved with the AMTEC board. I was also a Commonwealth Relations Trust bursar. And most recently, I've been involved with the AMTEC Trust as its chair. So for our next guest, I would, Katie, I'm going to bring up the consent to use form.
Okay.
And then we'll follow up with more formal introductions here. Okay. Let me just share a screen. Are you seeing it?
I am. Yep.
So, we sent this earlier, you've read it and you're okay?
Yep, I'm good.
Okay. So over to you, Diane, if you want to do the formal introductions.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure today to introduce you to Dr. Katy Campbell. Katy was born in Edmonton, received her PhD in 1994 in Instructional Studies from the University of Alberta. Her doctoral research involved a narrative study of a collaborative instructional design process as socially transformative space. Katy is the Dean Emeritus of the Faculty of Extension, where she served from 2009 to 2019. She's worked as an instructional designer in the Faculty of Education at the University of Alberta, as an assistant professor at the College of Education at State University, New York College at, I'm not sure I'm saying this right, Geneseo?
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 No, Geneseo.
Geneseo. And as a designer of distance programs at Keewatin Community College in Manitoba up until 1996. She's currently a professor in women's and gender studies at the University of Alberta. So welcome, Katy.
Thanks. Thanks. Glad to be here and to see all you familiar faces. Chris, I haven't seen your face in a long time.
Yeah, I was thinking that because I remember when you're doing your PhD research, I think you came by UBC when Tony Bates was there and you did an interview with me. And
I did.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, that was my doctoral research. That was a long time ago.
I know. But still, doesn't seem like a long time ago.
Oh, okay. It's sort of ironic that you've asked me to serve as a memory keeper, because the older I get, naturally, the less reliable my memory is, especially with dates and things like that. So I'll do my best.
You can always be creative and make things up, No
one will notice.
Well, interestingly enough, Katy, that's one of the reasons why we started talking and working on this project. This year is the 50th anniversary of AMTEC. Wow. And we were finding that, we were starting to realize that we hadn't captured the knowledge of so many of our memory keepers. And many of them were retiring. And so some of their documents and materials were not necessarily going anywhere other than into storage. So it was the perfect opportunity for us to really tap into that knowledge before, as you say, it disappears as we all get older.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's a great project. Excellent project. I'm so glad to be part of it.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun to work with Chris and Cindy, I must admit.
Yeah.
I'll ask the first question. So I did talk a little bit about your history, but maybe you can talk a bit about how you came to be who you are and how you connected to AMTEC in your either in your studies or in your work.
Sure. My identity journey.
Yes.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, I started off professional life as a French teacher, actually, in the what would that have been, the late 70s. And about 1980-ish, I guess, Apple computers kind of, made an appearance at Edmonton Public Schools. And not that we saw one in a classroom or anything, but we kind of heard about them. And, they were in the news. And then I went on maternity leave. And I wanted to do a master's degree in curriculum and instruction in not foreign languages. What were they called at that time? I don't know, modern languages, I guess. And right about that time, I had the opportunity to do an in-service at Edmonton with Edmonton Public Schools downtown, and I saw an Apple computer for the very first time in my life. And of course, it was pretty. There was nothing going on really, right? With whatever it was, 16K memory. But I do remember thinking, holy, like what could we do here in the French class? And then when I went into my master's degree, I got hooked up with Dr. Doug Parker, who was very interested in technology in the classroom. And he was working with David Mappin at the time at the University of Alberta. And he and David got very interested in interactive video discs. Now I'm going to really age myself. So I came in as a graduate student, got assigned to Doug Parker, and he said, well, I've got this thing we're working on for simulations in the French language classroom. Would you like to work with me? And he showed me this, really clunky kind of simulation. He was using SMPTE on reel-to-reel videotape and basic programming language, right? And so I saw that, and it was just like an epiphany. I just, whoa, look what we could do with teaching and learning and technology. And so for a couple of years as a graduate student, I was working with Doug Parker and David Mappin on these video discs, and David began to call me an instructional designer. I had no idea what that was. I'd never heard of that in my life. That would have been in like 82 by that time. And so my role really expanded from graduate student. I kind of threw over teaching French and thought, this is where I want to be. I kind of want to be in this lab, right? This innovation lab. And so I can remember he said, you're an instructional designer, put me on all these projects. And I'm thinking, what the hell is that? And so, I'd work with faculty members, and then I dashed to the library and try to, find anything I could on instructional design. And, of course, what I was finding was very, behaviorist oriented and, sort of cognitive science at that time. And I began to think, that's not what I'm doing, actually. That's really not how the process is unfolding for me. So that kind of, that led me to reading, not to graduate work yet. But in the meantime, Dave Mappin had offered me a job. Not a permanent job, really, like a 2-year contract. And much to my mother's and everybody else's horror, because especially my husband's, because we just bought a house and the big mortgage, I dashed down to Edmonton Public, resigned on the spot, and came back at like half the salary to work with David Mappin for 2 years. And I just got immersed, right, in the kinds of things that he was interested in, and the sorts of services and support we were providing the Faculty of Education. And probably it wasn't more than 2 years into that he said, I belong to this association. It's called AMTEC, and it's meeting in Calgary. And if you would like to make a presentation with me on these video discs that we're doing, we'll pay your way. And I thought, wow, a conference, like, holy cow, professional conference. So we went down to Calgary, and remember we stayed in the student residences, that was AMTEC on a shoestring, I think, at the time. And so I met all kinds of people. First time I met Rick Schweer and Larry, I can't remember his last name, at the University of Calgary, who was also working with video discs. He was in kinesiology. Anybody remember him? I was going to say Larry Cates. Larry Cates, by any chance? Anyways, there's this, group of people working with simulations and, with interactive video and so on. And so, we did this paper, and David began to talk to me about scholarship. And that was the association, or the group in Canada that was associated with scholarship, right, in media and technology. So my membership in AMTEC probably started in the very early 80s. And it was just, they were my peeps. I just felt that they were my peeps. And so, I was a member of AMTEC until it became CNIE. And at that point, I was probably deaning at that time, and I'm not able to really carry on too much with my research. I tried, but it was pretty difficult. So I kind of got out of touch. Is that what you're interested in?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So when you started to get involved with AMTEC and the folks that you met, like Rick and who we interviewed, and Larry, who we need to find a last name for, how did it change the way that you thought about technology? I mean, you had a pretty powerful mentor to start with in terms of David.
Yeah.
So what did it mean to connect at a graduate student level with all of these other folks that were sort of your peeps, thinking the way you were thinking?
Yeah. Well, there's lots there. At the time I was trying to figure out what instructional design, as a design profession actually was, sort of what were the disciplinary, and theoretical, sorts of backgrounds and that kind of thing. And so AMTEC was such an inclusive organization that there were all of those kinds of things represented. I mean, if I was still interested in K-12, there were all the K-12 folks. If I was interested in policy, there were government folks involved. If I wanted to go down the road of academia, there were lots of academics, and they were really accessible academics. So they weren't kind of an elitist group that kind of hung around together and only brought the graduate students in once in a while, and they were we sat at the feet of them. They weren't those kinds of people. And there were instructional designers that were emerging, and instructional design, I don't think at that time in Canada was really a big thing. There was Concordia University had a PhD program. There were a couple of graduate programs in distance education, as I recall, but there wasn't really one called instructional design, right, or instructional technology or educational technology in Canada. A little bit in Saskatchewan, maybe. BC was kind of nibbling around the edges a little bit.
About Memorial would have been just starting the program that I was in.
Yeah.
So in the early 80s. So by the time I got there, which would have been the late 80s, they had a master's in ed tech. But it was
one of the few, right? It was one of the few. It wasn't really a thing in Canada. And so the sort of the heroes and so on that I was reading about, they were all out of the States. They were people like Gagné and Thomas Duffy and my favorite David Jonason. And they'd really all sort of come out of this particular tradition, right? So their doctorates were all supported by the U.S. military, and they were all working in this kind of military industrial complex. And while I loved some of them, like David Jonason, others I thought, oh, what are you kidding? I won't name names. Yeah. Gagné comes to mind, and David Merrill. And they just weren't describing things that we were doing in Canada, and they weren't, they didn't seem to be, I don't know, they seemed to be so focused in, on ed tech, I guess, and AMTEC. Was such an inclusive organization. I mean, there were distance educators, there were, CADE media teachers, there were graphic artists later. There were, people like me sort of trying to find their place, in this whole milieu. There were academics and policymakers. I mean, it was just such a broad and actually deep organization. There were all these kinds of, cross-cutting things and links, and you go to an AMTEC conference and it wasn't, we didn't have sort of SIGs or anything, right? I mean, all the sessions that we went to were very ecumenical, maybe if I can use the word, and there was always such a great social underpinning to them. And, later on when I started going to AECT and other conferences, there was none of that at all. There was maybe sort of a special interest group that had a lunch, and they did administrative stuff, right? They did governance stuff, but there was none of that sort of relational kind of atmosphere that we had at AMTEC.
So, Katie, what we've heard from some of the other memory keepers is the networking that you've just talked about, but also that AMTEC was really a creation out of AECT. It was the Canadians who went to AECT and then connected with each other and then came home, I guess, and built something that was more adapted to the needs in our country, smaller, more friendly, more welcoming, and more, as you say, ecumenical, more open to even those of us, like when I was at the NFB and just doing the media festival, I was still, welcome kind of, and therefore inspired by what I was seeing people were doing with the NFB films that I was, marketing.
Yes.
In their classrooms, and how they were handling that and how they were talking about that. And so maybe inspired by AECT, but truly Canadian, born and bred.
Absolutely. I really felt that. I didn't really understand that until I'd spent a few years in the United States in my first academic job. You go down there and think, well, I'm not American, I'm not British. What am I? Right. But you kind of get a sense right away of what it is to be Canadian when you're in those environments. And I remember at that time, Rick Schweer and a few others were asking me if I would be the treasurer, the AMTEC treasurer. And I'm in upstate New York thinking, how am I going to do that? Up here, having a miserable time anyways. And that's when I began to think, and I was going to AECT all the time and, various others. And, I began to think, what's it about? What's it about our Canadian community? That's so, like you said, so inspiring, so supportive. You could talk to, and you could go to anybody, you could pick up the phone, you could meet them there. You had questions, you had ideas, people were always willing to listen to them and pass you on to someone else who could help you. And you never really got that sense at all, with big, huge groups like AECT.
One of the things I felt too was we don't quite have a population in the United States, and we don't have the huge institutional resources, but I think part of the strength of AMTEC was being able to connect across coast to coast and geographically connect, but also I think, as you said, it was deep. It was K to 12, it was private institutions, it was libraries, it was universities and colleges.
Yeah, it was government. It was it was just everybody. You sort of got this sense. It's such a Canadian sense of pluralism.
Katie, a quick question to follow up on the offer to be treasurer from New York.
Yeah.
how did you manage? I mean, this would have been before, cell phones and internet
Yeah.
and so on. So I'm guessing fax machines and email, or fax machines and regular mail.
Well, actually, I turned that down. I said,
Ah,
I just can't even imagine how I would do this from here. And plus, that was never my preferred thing to do, anyways. Anything to do with finances. Didn't think I'd do a good job, but I did think I was so desperately unhappy, in New York, and I thought, oh, just to be, with those folks again in any kind of capacity would have been wonderful. It really would have been kind of an emotional lifesaver, but I just knew I couldn't pull that off from there.
yeah.
Mhm.
So you came back to Canada
Mhm.
after that stint, and your AMTEC connection didn't go away.
No, because I was still a member
Yeah.
of AMTEC. I might have even come to a conference the time I was in the States. I can't remember, but I came back, went to northern Manitoba, to the PA actually, to be the distance education something or other. Might have been coordinator at Keewatin Community College, and I remember I wasn't really I just had a very serious bout of depression, ended up hospitalized and so on in the States. And at that time, I was desperate to come home to anything, including homelessness, just as long as I could come back to Canada. And I guess this job opportunity had come up at Keewatin. I don't really remember it, but it was probably a telephone interview. This was just before I went into the hospital the first time. And when I came out, I hadn't remembered it at all. And then I got a phone call from someone on the interview committee who said, well, do you want this job or not? What job? So I had to, kind of look it up again. And I wasn't at all qualified for it. I mean, that's a woman's story, right? You think, oh, I haven't done that before. I'm not qualified for that. I can't do it. But I was just so anxious, to come home that I said, oh, okay, well, I know what distance education is. I accepted the job. So I remember calling some friends and saying, I'm coming back to Canada. And some of them were AMTEC, Rick Schweer for one. And one of them called me back the next day and said, I'm looking at a map. Do you know where the PA actually is? Like, no. They said, well, maybe you should go, take a look. There was no Google at that time, of course, right? So as soon as I could, I went to the library and looked it up, and there was way nothing in between. But there were a few AMTEC people there, in the PA. And I hadn't known them before, but I got to know them then, and they were so lovely and kind. And so I was kind of back in touch. And Rick Schweer, I'd been writing as well, right? So, publishing in CJAC. And Rick Schweer got a hold of me again, and he said, why don't you think about being president of AMTEC? Out of the blue. That was out of the blue. Why would you think of me? Because I'd been away, right? And I said, well, and he said, but you have to be incoming president first, and you get a whole year under me, because I think he was the president at the time. Well, I love Rick Schweer madly. So, an opportunity to hang out with Rick Schweer, learning, the ins and outs, kind of the inside stuff on AMTEC was just, incredibly appealing. Right. So, yeah, so that's how I kind of got back into the mix with AMTEC.
Well,
And
cool.
I was expected to do all this distance education stuff, which I was just learning. The internet had it was the World Wide Web, right?
Yeah.
That had just become available in 93 or something. Was it 93 or 94?
Yeah.
So
Around
yeah.
there.
Yeah. So that was kind of the big thing. And my AMTEC colleagues, well, I remember Stephen Downs was at Brandon at the time. And I took a trip down to meet him. I thought, boy, what an iconoclast. But he sat with me for a couple of days and gave me kind of a lesson on HTML and Oh, who else was there from AMTEC? Oh, I can't remember her name. She's in Victoria now.
Mary
And then
Kennedy.
Mary
No.
Kennedy?
no, it wasn't Mary
No?
Kennedy. No, she was at Brandon too. Lori, who was the dean
Oh,
of
Larry, not Lori Wallace.
Lori Wallace. Yeah. Yeah. So got in touch with Lori Wallace again. And
Okay.
yeah. Yeah. So, AMTEC is always, for me, if I think about it, then being like a family that you can come home to,
Yeah.
right? Like when you
Yeah.
go away, they have to take you in when they come back.
You're like the long lost cousin that desperately needs a space.
Yeah, I guess.
So tell us a little bit about being president. I mean, you got to sort of learn the ropes under Rick's presidency. What do you think were some of the major challenges that were affecting AMTEC at the time that you were president?
Yeah, so by now it's the late 80s. No, by now it's the 90s. We're into the 90s, mid 90s, I guess, right? Mid to late 90s then. Well, politics were changing, in Canada, or they weren't changing so much as things, sort of bubbled up, receded and bubbled up and receded. But certainly we were really, really trying to think more about diversity. When I say AMTEC was really inclusive, I mean, it was very inclusive to people like me, right? But boy, we had a heck of a time involving any of our Francophone colleagues. We were able to involve folks from Quebec through Concordia and McGill, but University de Montreal, nobody, right? None of the CEGEPs, were present in AMTEC at all. We were really trying to make the journal a bilingual journal, and just bilingual abstracts weren't doing it, really. That was just really, really hard. So, I always felt that we couldn't really call ourselves, inclusively Canadian, because my Canada includes, Francophone Canada. We also didn't have really very much contribution or participation, I guess, from the Northwest Territories or the Yukon at that time. One or two, and I can't remember his name, but he was a civil servant in Ottawa, and he went to Iqaluit. Can't remember his name, but he did a lot of policy work in he's in the Ministry of Education or that equivalent in Nunavik, right? And so, that got a little bit of participation there. But now, looking back, we never even thought of Indigenous participation. I mean, wasn't on the radar at all. Of course, now you look back and think, oh, like, how could that have happened? Well, we know how it happens or happened. I don't know if CNIE is doing any better with that. We were pretty white. We were white. I mean, there's no other way to say that, white and English speaking. I mean, if we had any diversity at all, and I don't remember any. Yeah, I don't remember any, to tell you the truth. Diversity that we had. Well, maybe Phil Fraser. Remember Phil Fraser? Who was part of
He's a filmmaker in Alberta.
Yeah. So I think he wasn't a member of AMTEC, I don't think. But we certainly had him at various conferences as a keynote speaker. Yeah, I'm in fact embarrassed. I'm embarrassed. I'm appalled and embarrassed.
There was one academic that I knew a lot in CADE, and I don't know if he was involved with AMTEC. Clayton Wright.
Oh, Clayton Wright, of course.
I think he was out of Edmonton.
Yeah.
He was. You're absolutely right. I'd forgotten about Clayton Wright.
Yeah.
And there was also CYO, who was at the University of Alberta. He was Korean.
So, Katy, let's take this a little bit in a different direction. You were a woman in educational technology. There's an awful lot of non-friendliness to women in the ed tech world as well. But as president, you must have been able to do something about that, at least in your particular milieu, and or also, how did you feel as a woman in ed tech? Because that can be pretty strained as well.
It was and is, as a matter of fact. So I've always been a feminist, but I wouldn't say I was as aware a feminist. At that time, certainly in the mid 80s, as I became. So certainly, I was part of an Edmonton group, a local group that worked with AMTEC as well, the Edmonton, I forget, Media Society or something like that. All men, they were pretty brutal, as a matter of fact. And I can remember we were working, this was when I was president, it was time to have the conference in Edmonton. It was our turn. And we didn't want to have it at the same time as this Edmonton group had always wanted to have it, because it just didn't work for people across the country. I forget why. It was a bad time. So we said, the AMTEC planning group, of which Rick and I were part, said, we really can't do that at that time. And this group, which was full of men, pretty aggressive men, got really, really angry at us and said, well, we'll have nothing to do with you from now on. And we'd been depending on this group, right, to provide help with the venue and that kind of thing. And at that time, there was a new president of this group, and her name was Cindy too. And darned if I can remember what her last name was. And I can just remember the time that they gave her was unbelievable. Like we did end up having AMTEC here. We had to kind of go crawling back to this group because at the time we wanted to do a conference with CADE. And we were talking to Angie Wong and so on. And, all of us were beginning to think, why do we have CADE and AMTEC? There's so much crossover here, and it's such a small community. And why are we competing with each other, for everything? It just makes more sense to think about, learning technologies, sort of, in sort of all of these sectors and different deliveries and that kind of thing. So we're working with CADE. Liz Burge was the president at the time. And things were kind of going along okay for a conference. And then Liz Burge said, no, we're not doing it with you. And we were already like too far along, I think, to sort of start something new. So we had to go back to this group in Edmonton. This is a long, shaggy dog story. I'm sorry. So we end up having the conference in Edmonton. And I remember Cindy, as the president of the Edmonton Regional Group, was giving out flight awards and giving out, other kinds of awards and so on. And these guys would just literally elbow her off the stage. At one point, she was reading out the name of an award winner, and one of them took the papers out of her hand and kind of elbowed her aside, and took over like that. I watched that and was, pretty horrified. We didn't have a lot of credibility, in these groups at all. There were a lot of instructional designers that were women, but if you looked at that, what were those roles like in the institutions and, the organizations they were usually lower paid, right? They were usually non-academic positions or support positions. They were sort of never in management. So there was sort of, there was a peer group there. Very few of us really had any sort of overt or explicit, maybe leadership kinds of thoughts, maybe, or just opportunities we'd kind of given up, right? All the big names, all the big theoretical names out of the States, hardly any of them were women, maybe one or two. And if you look at the history that AECT always did, of the thought leaders, in educational technology, no women, appeared. That began to kind of piss me off, frankly. And plus, these guys were doing, no offense, Chris,
None taken. I'm not surprised.
But, these guys were doing the kind of research that it wasn't learner centered. It was all that optimal blueprint stuff, right? And, quasi-experimental design and stuff like that. And, make sure the teachers didn't mess it up. And, they were just kind of really, machine focused and stuff. There was no place for women's thinking. And that was a big issue for me, and probably why I started doing the kind of work that I was doing. So I started writing about design as relational practice. I started writing about it as feminist practice. I did my dissertation on design as narrative conversation. At that time, like, I couldn't get arrested, academically speaking. I couldn't get published. I remember a paper that I submitted, it came back with the reviewer saying, you can't talk about women if you don't talk about men. At the same time, and actually called the paper 10 dishes bullshit. So yeah, it was so obvious and punishing, right? That the kinds of things that women might have cared about, very learner oriented and collaborative work, and this kind of social justice things I'm really interested in now, along with Diane and Lorraine at McMaster, doing a lot of thinking about that kind of thing. That wasn't, that was women's work. The guys weren't interested in that kind of stuff. That was a rant. Sorry.
Completely appropriate in my experience as well. What I was going to say, though, is that that's where some of the really positive crossovers were with CADE, because distance education was also women's work. There were women leaders in the distance education world, and many of us were members of both organizations.
Right.
And when the talks began to happen about how a new national organization, bilingual national organization, might be formed, which is what CNIE became. There were the tensions between the two organizations. CADE was more francophone, more academic in some respects, more female in my memory anyway, with those leaders like Liz, who you mentioned, and Margaret Haughey,
Yep.
Right, and Laurie Wallace, and a bunch of others in the distance education world, who might also have been on the EdTech side, but not the leadership, not the governance on the AMTEC side. And so all of that came together into CNIE, and we do at CNIE our best to address some of these things. It's more open in some ways, but it's smaller too.
Yeah.
And the challenges of professional organizations that we all faced as university budgets were being reduced for professional development and things like that.
Not to mention the global
your experience too. Sorry, Diane. Yeah.
I was just going to say, and to add to that, the global competition.
Yes.
So we went from, as Chris pointed out, I think earlier, and Katy has commented on, AMTEC was a group of people who met regularly, but they were always sort of available to each other in terms of a quick phone call, or when email was invented, a quick email to find out where they were or what you needed. Whereas now you can join the American groups, the European groups, the South American groups, the African groups. They're sort of all parts of the world have something, either a journal or a conversational space. But it's interesting because I think we lose our national connection to each other, I think, to some extent in these other spaces.
A bit, though, but one thing that has occurred to me over the years, again, I'm thinking about some of the research Rick Schwer and I've done. Lots of those leaders in other geopolitical regions actually were educated in the States, right? So they went to Syracuse or Brigham Young or someplace like that. Really, they brought back American ideas. And so, if you look at some of the kinds of things that they're doing, I did a lot of work in Malaysia. It's very US centric thinking still, right? Whereas in Canada, we didn't really get into that. We didn't get into kind of Canadian-centric thinking. It was more, what, I don't know, practitioner-oriented, more, what are the problems that we have to solve? Like in this large country, this huge geographic space with so few people in it, and so many, people that were vulnerable, living in marginalized communities without access and that kind of thing. I mean, we really think about that kind of thing. And what other countries do? Australia.
It's interesting because I certainly, the people who taught me all came from Indiana, but not, they were Canadians who went to Indiana in Bloomington to sort of work with when Indiana was considered the top instructional design school.
Yeah.
But you're right. I think they brought back those ideas, and rather than just implementing them willy-nilly, something happened that changed the direction. And that's part of the reason, because that's how it's interesting, because I think this is our first conversation that sort of sparks the original conversation Chris and Cindy and I had, which was how different the pathway in Canada to educational technology and instructional design and distance education was compared to the United States. And yet so many of our mentors went to the States, did their degrees there, came back, and yet didn't automatically implement an American style ed tech program. Certainly not at Concordia, certainly not at the U of S, certainly not at my space at Memorial University, where two of my profs were both Indiana graduates.
Yeah.
And then of course you bring Tony Bates into the conversation, in the early 90s, and where he came from the UK, and his open education, open university focus. So it's interesting. It's I think it's the first conversation we've had so far that sort of acknowledged how that might have shifted. And I'm going to ask you another question too, because I want to pick up on what Cindy asked, and which was, being a woman in ed tech. I mean, has that changed for you, or are you watching younger women colleagues in instructional design, in ed tech, in distance education, finding their way into leadership in a much easier way, or do we still have some of those situations that you experienced occurring?
Well, to be honest, that's not the world that I'm in right now, right? Or I haven't been for the past 12 years. I've been in the extension world for the past 12 years, and really focusing on engagement scholarship and so on. Although now that I'm in women's and gender studies, it's really allowed me to focus in a different kind of way on what's happening in educational technology and in learning, and in access in particular. For example, I teach a course in social inclusion, and we take a look at an intersectional approach to inclusion on social media and that kind of thing. So that's been pretty interesting. I'm back into the literature now, and the literature has changed quite a bit, I would say, in sort of the past 10, 15 years. So we're not just looking now, of course, at gender, right? But we're looking at intersectionality. And we're taking, we're borrowing from critical theory, for example, to take a look at why people are excluded, from these kinds of environments or these kinds of roles. In my case, I look at higher education specifically, but there's a lot of research now on schools, K-12 schools, and other kinds of organizations in the training sector and so on. So I would have to say, sadly, from what I can see, that the situation hasn't changed much on the ground for those of us in those positions, but the thinking about it and the research into it is certainly way more critical now. It's international. It's intersectional. It's more inclusive. Of all the kinds of ways that people, exist in really masculinist kinds of disciplines and environments like universities. So lots of work on the culture and systemic barriers, that I haven't seen before. Before I kind of got shunted off into leadership. So, but has the practice changed? Are we in better shape? I mean, you can just look at the gender wage gap and say no. What's the deal there, right? Do we see more theorists like the thinkers, being acknowledged? Yes, I think so, because we're for one thing publishing more, right? And we have more of these positions, more of these professorial positions, for example, more of these school leadership positions. I think where we can make some differences. So, I think it's going to lag. That the changes in practice and behavior are going to lag for sure. But certainly the research is really picking up this stuff. What I said when I started, to publish about instructional design in a different kind of way. In thinking about it metaphorically and thinking about it relationally and thinking about it critically, I couldn't get arrested, and that's true. So I ended up publishing in journals, curriculum inquiry journals, feminist journals, those kinds of journals. But now I'm beginning to see, and I'm so glad to see it, that ETR&D and other journals, educational technology, and so on, specifically in the field, are now publishing things about inclusivity and access. Social access, for example. And I just reviewed a paper about female graduate students working with female professors in instructional design. It was an autoethnographic study, talking about some of the tensions and conflicts in working in this area for women. And you see more and more and more of that now emerging, not necessarily in ETR&D, but in other kinds of forums, right? So it's a matter of time, and it's a matter of numbers. Right. And I think it's also a matter of mentorship. So someone like David Mappin, he was a great mentor to me. He was no feminist, Margaret Hahi, though, she was just amazing. And she was always the kind of person you thought, I never want her to think ill of me. Like, I always want her to think the best of me. And so you worked for that, right? You just really worked for that. And there were other people like that. Right? Rick Schwer is a fabulous mentor. And I would say he is a feminist. And so they allow that space, for women. They make those opportunities for women. They support women, right, in those spaces. Tony Bates is another person, I think, like that. And then, they encourage women to bypass them, I guess, right? And, sort of move beyond them a little bit, and they don't sort of get jealous about that, or, they don't get sabotagey, about that. So, I think having mentors, for sure, we need male mentors who are already in those positions. We really need them to step up. And we need to make sure that more and more female mentors and more mentors of difference, let me put it that way, are in those positions and are able to step, and we support them in their work as well. Was that another rant? Sorry.
No, I would describe it as an outcome and an maybe unexpected but hoped for outcome of the kind of thing that AMTEC tried to do, because AMTEC was always focused on the appropriate use of technology for the appropriate kinds of learning. Exactly. And whether you were a practitioner or an academic, that's the language that sort of underpinned the newsletters, the journals, the mission and vision statement of AMTEC, and to some extent as much as was possible, the allocation of AMTEC awards when we had money to do that.
That's right. Yes. Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. So not a rant, just a description of reality.
I'll tell you a funny story actually about when I got the AMTEC Leadership Award. Chris, I think you were one of the people there that gave it to me. And I'd submitted a paper that year to the conference, but it was rejected. So anyways, I get a note, maybe it was even an email at the time. I forget who from, saying, well, aren't you coming to the conference this year? And I said, well, I can't, because my paper wasn't accepted, because the only way I could go, right, is if a paper was accepted and then I could get funding. And this person, I don't think it was you, Chris, it was someone else, said, but we really would like you to come. And I said, well, I just can't. And so he said, well, look, why don't you come to the luncheon anyways? And we'll stand you to lunch if you just come to the luncheon. So I said, okay, not knowing what was going on. So it was in Calgary. So I traveled down to Calgary for the day, and we're all lined up getting our tickets. And the person at the door taking the ticket said, where's your ticket? And I said, well, I was invited to the lunch. He said, you can't come in unless you. I said, well, I won't eat. It turns out that was the award luncheon, right? And I got the leadership award.
So you didn't get in.
And no lunch.
No.
So I didn't eat. So
My goodness.
wow.
That's a communication issue.
but it's funny, right? I mean,
Yeah, it is.
in a sense, it kind of tells a little bit of a story about AMTEC. I mean, it's all, we don't have secretariat in Washington, right? We don't have like these well-paid support, people. We're volunteers, right? We're really committed and passionate volunteers, and we put that work in. And of course, that kind of funny thing is going to happen if you've got volunteers, right?
Yeah.
But I would prefer it to the slick kind of Hollywood, or now Las Vegas, kind of show, right, that gets put on.
Well, one of the advantages of the smaller venue, although as Cindy mentioned earlier, it's getting harder and harder to maintain that given the financial and other circumstances, political and otherwise. But yes, I mean, I remember going to American conferences and being overwhelmed by the number of people that are there, thousands of people. And if you were really lucky, you saw one person more than once, and you sort of smiled and nodded because you both acknowledged that this was a familiar face. Whereas AMTEC, CADE, even now CNIE, I remember going to one that was set up years ago called NAWEB. I don't know if you remember it. It was out of New Brunswick.
Nope.
And I think it had maybe, I don't know, 100 people at it. And everyone at the end of that 4 days knew each other.
Yeah.
Like literally knew each other. And when you walked away, and I find that the same with CNIE and previous to that, AMTEC. It's hard to go to the conference and not walk away with new friendships.
It is, and it's, let's face it. I mean, if you've been to a conferences for a few years, you don't really go for new ideas necessarily. You're not going to be startled, with a lot of new ideas, because you're doing the reading and everything else. But the more successful ones, the ones where I've learned, are those ones where there are lots of opportunities to talk to people and, stay after a session. The sessions are small. You really get to, have a discussion in the sessions, right? People want to carry on afterwards talking, and, even when you get home again. And, that was AMTEC. I'm not sure if it's CNIE. I haven't been, but I'm reasonably certain that it is. CAUS, is another organization I've been involved with for quite a long time. The same kind of thing. It's family, that comes together, and we go to sessions and so on. But you don't get, once in a while. If I come away, I have to say, with a new idea or a new insight, just one, it's like, wow, okay, that was really worth the money. Right. But if I go to a big conference and you get a phone book like this,
yeah,
you're like, how do you even get into that? Right. And you'll never be able to talk to the person who gave the session because they're off again, to the next one. So, yeah. So it's and it's homey.
Yeah. I've always found that the value for AMTEC to me was going to these different areas of Canada and seeing what was going on. And I think I was always surprised at what was happening, and there'd be presentations from school boards in these remote
Yeah.
communities and the incredible work they were doing. Like that was kind of eye-opening for me.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, and that was, I mean, something that AMTEC was completely committed to, explicitly committed to, right? Was taking it across the country all the time. Rather than choosing one or two centers where you knew you would get people who also wanted to spend a week exploring Montreal, for example. I mean, those are appealing in some ways too, but we made it really our value. I think our values in AMTEC have always been made explicit. People can see them there, and we practice them, and if people feel that their values align, they will come, rather than just it's the only organization in Canada that talks about this stuff.
Well, and I also appreciate the fact that you're coming to AMTEC from so many different perspectives, because you worked in a K-12 teaching center situation, you worked in the college setting, you worked in the university setting, and then you worked in leadership within the university setting. So, I mean, each of those lenses is quite valuable, because AMTEC, I mean, CADE, my memory of CADE was that we were mostly universities doing the initial work on distance education. It hadn't filtered yet. There had been no COVID, so it hadn't filtered into even into virtual school systems. There were some small pockets, but nothing really serious happening in it. It was mostly at the university level. But AMTEC was all of those things. As you pointed out, you could talk K-12, or you could talk college, or you could talk ed tech media, film, or you could talk academics. So it was one of those really unusual groups that didn't have splinters, at least from my perspective.
No, that's right. Yeah. So, and we're not a big enough country anyways to have splinters. Or a big enough community. Let me put it that way, right?
Yeah.
Splinters. And I mean, COVID did show us that, right? I mean, it's all one. It's the best and most accessible learning environments. That's what we're all about, right? The most equitable, the most inclusive, the most critical, the most accessible, the most, those are the kinds of things we all care about, right? No matter where we come. And I have to say, I had a really kind of a moment of snickering with COVID. Don't tell anybody, but how many years have we all spent trying to convince faculty to even just think about what technology might be able to do, from resistance, hostility, the whole bit, and then in 3 days they have to pivot online, and I'm thinking, you could have listened. You could have used our expertise.
Yeah. The advantage today, and and I really was concerned during COVID that too many people were going to say that this distance education, online learning, was for the birds, because it was so badly done on so many levels in so many places. But what's interesting now as a faculty developer is that I don't spend my time anymore convincing someone it can be done online. Now the conversation is, how do I get to do it online? How can I do it better than I, made up during COVID? So the conversation has shifted, and some of my educational technology colleagues have suggested, EdTech moved about 10 years into the future. From where we were in 2019 to where we are today, it's moved ahead. What they would have predicted would have taken 10 years to do. We're suddenly sort of finding ourselves now in a place where we can have that legitimate conversation, and it's not go away. It's more, come in and tell me more. I may not like it, but come in and tell me more.
No, exactly. And I think that there's a couple of things that have happened there. For one thing, students have really appreciated and embraced the flexibility, right? Whereas before it was kind of like, no, I take notes and you teach me, and in face to face. And that's the only way that this can possibly happen. Now they've discovered, no, there's way more creative things that have actually happened in the past 3 years that they weren't aware of. And so now I find people not just taking, even if you say a class is a face-to-face class, that's not necessarily acceptable to them, right? They want different experiences and flexibility. So we really need to think about that. Of course, that makes it more complicated for instructors, right? But they too, I think, kicking and screaming as they were, they've realized that they've got some real benefits, out of having suddenly to teach online. They've discovered their inner innovation, sometimes their inner creativity. They've discovered how intimate, these kinds of conversations online can be, or forums can be. They've discovered they can do things they didn't think they could do. They've got more flexibility, in what they want to do. So, I think we were missing that before. People sort of were in their corners, and not really having the experience that would have opened them up to a different way of thinking. Now we just have to prevent university presidents like ours from saying, okay, now we can add 20,000 more new students with no new funding. And now that we're all online, we can handle that, right?
Right.
Any more questions? This has been fabulous, absolutely fabulous.
I don't have any more questions. I would only say to your last point about the presidents, there's an awful lot of research you can point to now that is convincing when they say things like that, where there didn't used to be evidence. So the challenge is to stay on top of the evidence.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. Which you get to do when you're retired, maybe.
Chris Are you retired?
Well, so Chris and I are both retiring at the end of March. And maybe we can stay on top of some of that. And so there's this leadership element that comes out of the AMTEC experience as well. And it's not formal leadership necessarily, it's like influence. So anyway, I just wanted to drop that in because the presidents are aware that there's research now and they didn't used to be. So the process of convincing is perhaps slightly less challenging. Mm-hmm. If you can stay on top of the research, and that's the challenge.
And if you get an audience.
Chris, did you want to ask about the AMTEC quilt?
Oh yeah, that was my mystery question. So I can share it. So we're trying to find the history of the AMTEC quilt, and it is a total mystery right now. We've asked several people about its source, where it came from. It just always seems to have been there. So I don't know.
I remember. Yeah. If I might be wrong, but Maureen, what was her name? McGovern? No, that's a singer. Erin. She was involved with that, wasn't she?
No, we've asked her.
Oh.
We asked Mary Kennedy, Maureen.
Yeah.
We've asked Rick, and we've asked
Gary Carlson and everybody. Ray Whitney.
Oh, but I can't really. Oh, that would be terrible to lose.
We have it.
We have the quilt.
Okay.
We have the physical quilt. We just have no history on it. Like, we have no idea who created it. Yeah. We can ascertain its age based on the last panel that was added. I'm making an assumption that, each panel was quilted for the year that the panel represents. Yeah. So we sort of have this is when it might have started and this is when it clearly ended, but we have no idea whose fingers touched it.
It was a traveling kind of quilt, right? Yeah. Like it came to each conference. So, maybe the conference organizing group was responsible for the panel for that year, I guess.
Yeah. But
no idea where it came from, no idea whose idea it was. We've searched documents, we've searched memories. It remains a mystery. It's a bit like Oak Island.
you believe that thing is still going? Rip the island up, I don't know.
I have a feeling there's a Netflix series in this at some point. Like, where did the quilt come from, and is it engendered with magical powers?
Gee, if only we had the emails of every single person that was ever involved in AMTEC, we could find that out.
Yeah.
But I suspect people who would really know are no longer with us.
Yeah.
Yeah, it could be. And some of the people we thought would know for sure didn't know. So
no, one day we may stumble across someone.
Yeah. He says, okay, Gary, I remember that. Well, I hope you do. Well, what do you do? What's happening with this series once it's finished? If it ever is finished.
So it's a living project.
Okay.
But AMTEC is celebrating its 50th anniversary, or at least we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the founding of AMTEC. And there'll be a little note about that at the annual general meeting of CNIE, and it'll be at the CNIE conference. It'll be announced. We're building a website off the CNIE website. And these videos are all being posted to the CNIE YouTube channel. So they are available. And that's helpful. We hope that might inspire some people to remember a few things. There are documents that we're collecting, and we're actually meeting tomorrow to find out what the next steps are in terms of making those accessible to anybody who might be interested. So the project continues. And I don't know, Diane and Chris, maybe there's other things I haven't mentioned there.
Well, we did. So one of the things that happened when AMTEC and CADE, I hesitate to use the word merged because that's a sensitive topic. But when they joined together, to create CNIE, several folks, Judy Roberts and Michael Imbuco, if I have his name spoken properly,
Umbriaco.
They wrote a history of CADE up to that point. And it was a lovely sort of academic piece. They had gone through a number of things to establish it. So one of the things that Chris, Cindy, and myself have done is written a piece. It's actually to celebrate the AECT 100th anniversary. But interestingly enough, in our research, we discovered that AMTEC is 50 years old, and so is the Australian version of AMTEC, was also 50 years old. So somewhere in 1973, something happened that just created these sort of multiple layers of offshoots. So we put together an article on where AMTEC came from, all of the organizations like CAVA and others that were basically the thought genesis of AMTEC, and then AMTEC through its history and its support of journals and presidents and so on, and then finally its movement into its new incarnation of CNIE. So we haven't heard yet, I don't think, on that, but the intention is to publish in Tech Trends sometime in the next couple of months, I think.
Oh, great. Well, I get that, so I'll be looking out for it.
Yeah. And we're kind of open, I think, to doing more if we can find more people. We've got still some interviews to do, and we keep finding new people who are mentioned by others. You've mentioned some names today that we hadn't connected to interviews in the AMTEC context. So we'll talk about that. So it's not dead. The idea is to make it a living project, a living history project.
We're definitely going to need to sort of wrangle Cindy and Chris's calendars, after the 1st of April. But beyond that,
because you'll both be traveling the world, right?
Absolutely.
In the go-go years. It's the go-go years, I hear.
That's right. I'm going to zoom in from Seville, Spain.
Ooh, nice.
Not me. I'm not going anywhere, but that's fine. And we can, what we've always known in educational technology is that you can communicate without having to be in the same room.
That's right.
And so we continue to do this. And so the product becomes a part of the process of connecting with people, across time zones and countries to some extent.
Yeah, that's like narrative, right? Process and product.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it's all about the story.
It's all about the
So,
story, absolutely. It's a digital quilt that we're creating, right?
and we're very lucky because I just had the opportunity to take a look at a book that just came out of I don't think well, the two authors came out of Athabasca, Bainbridge and Work, I think.
Work. You're talking about the Encyclopedia of Women in Distance Education.
Yes, and
Yeah, I
even
saw
in
that.
the time that they created the document and published it, they lost two memory keepers. And so that's something we were very conscious of when we started. There's several folks that would have been ideal for us to talk to. And I suspect one of them might have actually known the quilt story, but they've since passed. And so the idea is to where possible, bring the stories forward so that, future educational developers, future educational technologists, future historians and academics can hear the voice of how Canadian AMTEC and Canadian media became the way it is.
Right. That's really important. Rick Schwer said something, about that once. He said, he was talking to colleagues and who were saying, "Oh, there's no research, in educational technology," and he said, there's so much of it I can't keep on top of it, and it goes back over 100 years, well over 100 years. So no wonder if I can't keep on top of it, and it's my field. That you would think there was nothing there. And I think a project like this is really important, for our, our successors, to know that this has been a vital community, right? For not just 50 years, but, however many years that there's something there that they're building on.
Mhm.
And there's something I think really important about that. There are ancestors, right?
Mhm.
Have ancestors.
Yes, good point.
Yeah. And on top of all of that, these conversations are wonderful and fun and energizing and encouraging. And we've really enjoyed talking to you today, Katie. So thank you so much for your time and all your memories.
Oh, ditto. Well, thanks for thinking of me.
Thanks, Katie.
Okay, talk to you later.
Thanks, Katie. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.